Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Supercharging Ad Spend with Incrementality. We're just going to jump right in. Quick overview of our agenda today. First, we're going to cover a handful of attribution methodologies and how they work and why they're important to consider in building your attribution practice. We will do a brief overview of incrementality and incrementality testing. We'll cover select insights from the measured incrementality platform, and then we'll provide some expert advice on building a gold standard attribution practice. We will follow the session with a Q&A session. You can participate again using the Slido tool. You will see the login instructions on a handful of screens coming up, and you'll be able to vote on other participants' questions as well to encourage them to get answered when we get to our Q&A session. Very excited to introduce today's expert panel. We have Noelle Sadler-Delory. She is a veteran CMO with experience from ThreadUp and Lulu's. Thank you so much for joining, Noelle.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Did you want me to do a quick intro right now, Clay?
Sure. Yes. More than welcome to.
Okay. The quick Venn diagram of Noelle's experience. If you had to take all the people who have made violent video games over here and all the people who have sold lipstick over here, I think I might be the only person in the crosshatch area who's done both. So lots of experience on the content and creative side with Rockstar Games and in the film industry. And then more recently, as Clay mentioned, on the marketing side with some big fun brands like Mac, ThreadUp, and Lulu's. So really excited to be here and talk with everyone today.
Thank you so much, Noelle. We're glad to have you. Next, we have Andrew Cavato, who is a measurement consultant. He has held titles like head of measurement at Snap and also has a lot of experience from Google, Netflix, Meta, and others. Andrew, thank you so much for joining. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love working with measurement companies and marketers that are doing smart measurement. And I love to help more and more marketers and more measurement platforms to fall into that category. Unlike Noelle, I've not sold violent video games or lipstick, but I have played violent video games and I've bought lipstick for my lovely 5-year-old daughter. So I'm excited to be here and look forward to getting into the nitty-gritty of incrementality and how this can help you in your practice.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And then additionally, we have Nick Stoltz, the COO here at Measured, who is a veteran in all things attribution. Nick, welcome. Do you want to give us a little snapshot of your background?
Yeah, I mean, I have been with independent measurement companies for longer than I care to remember, and I've done MMM, MTA, incrementality, all forms of marketing measurement and attribution for companies of all shapes and sizes and industries. So happy to be here. Thanks, Clay.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Just a quick, brief overview of Measured. Measured is a comprehensive end-to-end media optimization platform. We help brands of all sizes test, report, analyze, and reallocate their media budget to higher performing channels, powered by our platform, which has the world's largest library of incrementality tests. And we'll jump right in. We're going to kick off today with a quick poll to the participants in the audience. You can go to slido.com in an open browser window or on your phone and enter the code 1665435, or you can use the QR code right there on your screen. We'll just give a few extra seconds for this first poll as people join the Slido. Thank you for the first vote there on incrementality measurement. And I love that we can see the results coming in live. So
it's so interesting to see these results shift around. In a lot of ways, a lot of these are very intertwined. So it's really interesting to see where marketers are prioritizing their time.
Right. And I think it makes sense given the topic of the webinar that incrementality is the number one. But as you mentioned, we will be covering a handful of these other topics today. Okay, great. I think it's pretty clear incrementality measurement is the winner and media mix modeling close behind. All right, we'll jump into some of the content. So here's a kind of a high-level overview of attribution over the last several decades. Nick, if we zoom in on the right-hand side of this timeline, how have you seen this kind of evolution play out over the last decade plus?
I think it's interesting because if you sort of look, all of these kind of approaches came out of a need from marketers. And I would say none of them has really gone away. We can maybe talk, and I know Andrew will talk a little bit about multi-touch attribution, but I think as things have evolved, marketers have kind of realized that they need different tools to answer different questions, right? So marketing mix modeling came out of a place of like trying to understand what my media is doing outside of old school traditional research and focus groups. Last touch attribution was about understanding, specifically for digital media and addressable media, kind of user pathways and where media was touching and how people were converting. Multi-touch was kind of an offshoot of that, of saying, hey, maybe the last media that or click or impression that someone touches isn't the one doing the heavy lifting. And finally, I think incrementality is coming in and kind of rounding out the piece of this, and it's filling a gap, right? Whether you're talking about marketing mix or last touch or multi-touch, those are modeled approaches, they're attribution approaches. Incrementality is about establishing a causal relationship. And frankly, if incrementality is being used right, it should be paired with these other things, and it should be paired with your attribution and reporting to make it better, make sure that it's right, make sure that it's more agile, make sure that it's responsive. I don't sort of see this as a replacement. I see this as filling a much needed gap in the spectrum of marketing measurement and attribution.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And what you kind of highlight there is that there's an impetus to these shifts in the ecosystem. And what we see here, and especially with the rise of incrementality and the big wave of changes in the industry the last 10 years, is really data privacy regulations. But there's also a handful of other challenges and reasons brands need to consider which attribution solution is right for them. Noel, a question for you from kind of the brand perspective. In your experience, when did you start to recognize the need to look at new attribution solutions?
Yeah, we were fortunate in the fact that we were hearing directly from Google actually before they were starting to make some big changes around privacy in response to privacy regulation, I should say. And we were aware that we would start to have less visibility directly from the big Google machine. And so that was an initial impetus for us to start thinking about a different way to look at our attribution, which at the time had been really focused on last click. So to Nick's earlier point, we also were putting a lot more money into that, anything that was driving that last click or last touch. And we also had a sense that there were other areas that weren't getting the love and attention, AKA budget, because we couldn't prove out as easily with that last click model. So one was just seeing the writing on the wall that things were going to change and we weren't going to have the visibility we had. And then the other was trying to set a level playing field and create the sort of more apples to apples comparison by channel. And that actually worked out really well for us because we already had that set up before then all the iOS changes came out. So we already had a pretty good understanding of which channels performed best, especially from the perspective of incrementality before that onslaught came and changed everyone's ability to really see what was happening with their measurement.
Great. Thank you, Noel. That's interesting. Andrew, would you mind sharing a little bit of the platform perspective on this? Like, how do platforms like Snap and Meta think about these changes and challenges as they work to provide analytics to their buyers and advertisers?
Yeah, the platforms are really in an interesting place because on the one hand, they're fully aware of incrementality and using, RCTs, randomized controlled trials, to properly assess marketing efficacy, but their ad tech stacks are not inherently built on incrementality. They're built on correlative signals, taking in, a lot of behavioral signals that people are doing on and off the platforms, mashing all this data together and using it to calculate the probability that somebody will convert on an ad, not the probability that somebody will convert because of the ad, but only subsequent to exposure or interaction with that ad. And so that means that they're really, really good at showing ads to people who want to buy, whatever it is that the ad is sort of advertising. But they're not quite as good from an ad tech perspective at influencing somebody who wouldn't otherwise have bought. And so a lot of what they're doing is kind of on two sides. One, they're trying to develop technologies, and you can think sort of clean room-esque technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, privacy safe data matching technologies that will allow that sort of legacy ad tech stack to continue into the future and allow that legacy attribution, post-exposure attribution, to continue in the future. So they're investing a lot in that, but they're also understanding that the marketers are starting to demand a bit more of incrementality based measurement, and so they are leaning in a little bit more to modeling out incrementality, trying to find ways to incorporate modeled incrementality into some of those ad delivery models and whatnot. Of course, they're also expanding partnerships with third-party incrementality providers, as well as building up their first-party incrementality products, which we're going to talk about later, but there's a lot of challenges with those as well. So long story short, they're in a complex world right now, but what has worked in the past is becoming exponentially more difficult to do, both from an ad delivery and a reporting perspective, because of all of the privacy changes that we're seeing right now.
Great, thank you. And what I was going to kind of comment on that you mentioned is what you're really talking about there in the beginning is incrementality. Is just because somebody sees an ad and then makes a purchase doesn't mean that the ad necessarily caused that purchase. And there's a lot of different ad platforms that tend to fall into different categories in terms of how buyers are using those platforms for certain objectives and what their reporting looks like. This brings us to this slide we're calling Methodology Matters, where the way that you measure media, the attribution solution you choose to use will obviously have a pretty strong impact on potentially the decisions you would make in reallocating your investment. Google brand search is a great example here, where Google brand search, a consumer comes to Google, searches for your particular brand, you're paying for an ad, they click on that ad, and then they make a purchase. But a lot of those consumers may not really be that incremental because they were already showing high intent to make a purchase for your brand. Noel, looking at this data, and also just to highlight, this is from the measured platform last month. So this is very recent May 2023 data across a handful of tactics, showing the last click ROAS or the platform reported ROAS in blue, and then the incremental ROAS in orange. Noel, do you find this data surprising at all, looking at this chart?
In a word, no. The platforms all measure things differently. And I think one thing to think about as a marketer or a brand person is you have that healthy skepticism about what's being reported, because at the end of the day, each of those platforms is trying to sell more product and make more money. And yes, also helping you as a brand do the same thing. But so that's one thing to keep in mind is they are hoping you'll spend more money with them. Then on the other hand, the way everything is reported is slightly different, or in some cases drastically different. So, going back to that, how do you compare all of these apples to apples? You're not really able to do that if you're focusing purely on platform reported data. And then to your point, Clay, something like brand search, where somebody already knows you, they already probably know what they want, and then you just made it easy for them to click on that, and then you paid for it. There's a couple different ways of handling that. One is you increase your ROAS requirements on some of those channels just to even things out and level the playing field. But the other is to really get an understanding of incrementally, did that additional dollar you spend bring that additional dollar in? Now, what I will say, though, is it doesn't mean you should throw away everything that you hear from the platforms. I think it's really helpful from a sort of triangulation perspective, especially as so many changes are happening all the time, just to keep an eye on sort of what the historical has looked like and how does that compare to what you're measuring yourself. So that's one good way of understanding if there's a gap that needs to be filled or one that suddenly emerges and understanding why. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about why those numbers are happening. And then one other thing I will add is, just because something looks like it's not working from a certain perspective once, that doesn't mean it won't work for your brand in the future. So we've tested into different tactics, with Google, with Facebook, YouTube, that in a short-term period, for whatever reason, they didn't work for our brand. And so we pause, and then you go back and you test again, and you might see a completely different story, either because the platform has changed, the audience and how they interact with that product has changed, or the product has changed to make it better for brands. So it's helpful to keep an eye on all of this just to understand what sort of normalized looks like for the platforms, and then what your data is showing you and where are the discrepancies and how can you either bring them closer together or action on some of those opportunities.
Noel, I often see, and when brands kind of move off of particularly like platform and site-side analytics and kind of into, attribution, right? There's this expectation that like, hey, I think my channel mix is off, which there's some of that, but I tend to find that it's really funnel mix is where you get, more misaligned with some of these things. And look, it makes a lot of sense, obviously, in practicality, like, hey, those sort of measurement approaches are really biased to the last click and the last thing you see. And so that tends to kind of push you down the funnel. Was that your experience as you kind of move from platform reporting to, an incrementality based solution?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just to clarify, primarily, we've not used platform reporting directly at the brands I've been at, but we've used our own attribution model, which initially when we got started was last click. So it's still same issue, but just in a different location. Yeah, I think one way to look at it is you can look at it by tactic like this, like you see here, and see, oh, this works well, this doesn't. But each of these tactics is also related to a different area of someone knowing your brand and interacting or trusting or purchasing or repurchasing. And so another way to sort of cross-section this data is by organizing it by where somebody is in the funnel, or which tactics are in which part of the funnel: awareness driving and prospecting, conquesting in some cases, going against another brand, or the down funnel tactics. And then you can start to look at, as a whole, is this mix working for this section of the funnel or this audience, in each section. It's a more holistic view of it. And then you're also not trying to, compare brand search on the one hand with a YouTube ad, for example, or TikTok on the other, because to your point, they're inherently a different customer experience and a different customer looking for a different thing.
Great.
One quick, and if I wanted to point one thing out here to the audience, one thing that's interesting to look at this data is, first of all, the ordering, which may surprise some about the relative incrementality of the different products that are listed here. But to me, what stands out more than anything is the fact that the incremental ROAS is in all cases lower than the last click ROAS. And so, and I'm sure maybe most people noticed that, but I just really wanted to underscore that point. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, last click being a predictive and a correlative metric. So the system is optimized to that, and it is also measured that way. So it's in a lot of ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that none of the ad tech platforms are working and it's all wrong. The thing that's really maybe frustrating for marketers is that it's not all the way wrong. It's like just wrong enough that you don't notice it, or you maybe don't notice it in certain cases, but it's certainly not optimal if you're looking at things exclusively from a post-exposure attribution perspective. So that's why it's very, very important, no matter what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, to double check. And we'll talk about this later on, but to do something that really helps you understand what is the overall incrementality that your mix or your channels individually are contributing. So, one thing that I've always believed, and this may be a bit of a pessimistic perspective, is that most of the ad platforms, all of the ad platforms, in fact, are overvalued if you look at them the wrong way. And I think that it's not that they're not working, it's not that you should advertise less, but you definitely need to test into it scientifically to understand how to properly deploy that spend.
Great points, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion there. That's great. Just a quick reminder to folks, you'll see this note on the bottom of every slide. If you go to slido.com and enter the code, you will be able to start asking questions. We have one rolling in so far, but looks like a few others have started jumping in. So feel free to jump in there and start asking questions. Wanted to provide a quick, simple chart, just an overview of some of the methods we've talked about so far. Andrew, going to throw a question back to you. MMM and incrementality clearly have a place in today's environment. There's a lot of interest around both of these methodologies. But what about MTA? What's going on with multi-touch, and what should marketers know about it?
Look, I've always been known to kind of speak my mind and to be a bit aggressive in my opinion. So I'll give you my honest opinion here, which is that multi-touch attribution should no longer be used. It's pretty much useless at this point, and it's going to become increasingly useless. And I've sat on some industry boards where this has been a hotly debated topic, but let me kind of explain my perspective on it. The roads have changed, right? And you think about, using this analogy of all the data privacy regulation, that's all kind of the highways and roads that we use to do attribution. And, right now we've got freeways. And if you were to go and try to get a horse and buggy, yes, it could still get you from point A to point B, but is that really going to work alongside trucks that are going 70 miles an hour? It's not going to work. And unfortunately, multi-touch attribution is a bit of a horse and buggy situation when it comes to attribution and assessing media efficacy. So yes, there are probably some specific instances where it may work, but all of the technology that right now is being built, again, I'm going to reference back to clean rooms and privacy enhancing technologies and secure data matching. All of that is really, it's not meant to take multi-touch attribution to the next level. It's meant to be a stopgap and to help get multi-touch attribution part of the way to where it was 5 years ago. And by the way, even 5 years ago, it didn't really work because you never had pure visibility into all of the granular exposure data from the platforms. They never wanted to play nice with each other. So you never really got a perfect view into the path to conversion that you could then, do some analytics on. Beyond that, methodologically, multi-touch attribution is not good because it's still correlative. So even if you had perfect data, unless you're doing some kind of randomization and holdout groups and that on that data, you're still coming up with a correlative model, regression model that is not, tuned to ground truth. And therefore, it's still going to give you the situation that we saw in the last slide where your MTA ROAS will be most likely inflated relative to your incrementality-based ROAS. So my opinion, and I would love to debate anybody who feels opposite, feel free to ping me and we can get into a discussion on it. But I think marketers should aggressively move away from multi-touch and invest more in things like MMM and incrementality, and then maybe use some lighter weight proxy measurement to do kind of shorter term optimization, but make sure it's always coming back to something causal, something incrementality based.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Andrew. That's a really good background there. And I think highlighting the correlation versus causation difference is very important. So this is not an all-inclusive visual of every possible way brands can leverage different attribution solutions. But Noel, you mentioned the idea of triangulation before, of using more than one solution to kind of get to a clean answer. And Andrew, you kind of highlighted something similar here. This is just kind of showing an example of kind of the different levels of sophistication and attribution practices that we tend to see brands deploying. Noel, this is a bit of a maturity curve here, although obviously every brand may not follow this exact path. Does this reflect your, the journey of any of the brands you've been a part of? And would you have any advice to brands who are just maybe starting to build an attribution practice? Maybe they're manually pulling data from different platforms or using GA, things like that, and they're trying to level up their practice. Any advice for kind of approaching the world of all these different solutions?
Yeah. To your point, I don't think it's necessarily like a step ladder approach that we walk through all these steps. I think most brands start at some point in the middle or at the start or somewhere along the line, sometimes take a step back, try lots of different things. And that's also totally natural and normal. I think one of the biggest things that happens when you are thinking about how do you measure everything is a lot of doubt and self-doubt and worry and self-questioning, right? And we certainly have gone through that everywhere I've worked. I don't think that's that's specific to me or my experience. I think that's true of any brand. When you're making a big shift in how you measure, it's like one of the most important things you do. Obviously, there's a lot of attention and concern and interest, and as there should be, because it's not something that you just undertake from one day to the next. Hey, we'll flip this switch and hope everything works out. So I think one thing is just being very aligned across anyone who is a key decision maker in the org on how we're going to measure going forward. In that case, in our case, that's been, obviously marketing and finance or FP&A, depending on how your teams are set up. If you have investors, then they're probably going to have a say in things as well in terms of the reports they're used to seeing, and or a board, same thing. So there's definitely a lot of conversation and I think discussion that happens along the way. So some of it is less about how do you go from one step to the next, and here's a checklist or a toolkit, and it's more about how do you just get everyone on board and feel comfortable with the choice that you're making? So that's one thing. And then the other seems like a pretty basic thing too, but really be clear on what your goal is. Like what is your goal as a company? What are you trying to achieve? And then you can, fit how you're testing and how you're modeling to that end goal. There might be multiple different goals or micro goals along the way. So ensuring that you can still track and measure and understand all of that, that you're not losing, some noise in the goal of losing noise. You don't want to necessarily lose everything that you're trying to measure. So it's definitely a group effort, I would say. And then the third is whether you build it in-house or you partner with someone like a Measure or another platform, really being very clear and treating, especially as a third party, them as a partner, almost an extension of your team. Because at the end, the goals should all align, right? Everybody should be working toward the same objectives and looking at measurement in the same way. And that just reminds me, if you work with an agency partner or multiple agency partners, same thing. Get them in the mix early, make sure they ask their questions too, because if your partners don't feel that they're going to be able to answer questions or report in the same way that they used to, based on a new platform or a new attribution model, ask those questions beforehand so that there's no surprises down the road.
Those are all great pieces of advice. Thank you, Noelle. Really appreciate that. One of the topics we get asked about a lot, and which has been coming up more and more recently, is this kind of category here on the right, what we call here test-informed MMM, where brands are combining incrementality testing and media mix modeling to, again, kind of triangulate answers to their media investment questions. Nick, you have a lot of experience in MMM. Can you tell us about the different ways brands are kind of combining these two things? Is there one way they're doing it, or are there different kind of possible scenarios in which you could use them together?
Yeah, I think first, I think media or market mix modeling is pretty mature. It's pretty widely used at this point, whether you've got a third party, first party solution, you name it. It's known technology, and it's good at some very specific things. It's improving and there are ways to kind of push the granularity and things like that. But it has a couple gaps that actually incrementality is a perfect match for, right? So the first is this correlation is not causation, right? The way a mixed model works is it looks for variables that move together, right? Problem is, most of your marketing variables move with your sales, right? So it is very difficult to suss out, the classic example everybody uses and I roll my eyes at, but like, hey, a mixed model would tell you that shark bites are caused by ice cream sales, right? Because those things tend to happen together. They both happen in the summer when people are at the beach. Shark bites are not caused by ice cream sales, right? Now a mixed model, it's only going to be as good as the person building it, their experience and things like that. There are a lot of choices that a modeler makes because there are thousands of variations of a model that will produce reasonably the same accuracy, and they can look very different. So you get down to the experience of the modeler and how good they are at either knowing or sussing out or using experience to kind of do these things. Incrementality fills that gap. It allows you to put, test and control experiments in market that give you specific answers that say, hey, brand search is not just correlated with my sales, it is driving this much of my sales for this specific time period. That can be used to either tune your mix model, or what I would strongly suggest, the kind of a best in class sort of approach is a Bayesian prior framework, where you can actually take test results, use those as priors or guardrails on your model, and actually have the model work within those test results. I think more and more and more, the way we are seeing the market move, given everything Andrew said around multi-touch attribution, which I wholeheartely agree with, it is moving towards this, more flexible, more agile mixed models that are tuned with testing. The other thing that I would say is this agility piece is really important. Mixed models are built on months and years of correlative data, market shocks, changes in your strategy, changes to your brand or product, COVID-19, iOS 17, all of the stuff we don't know that's coming. It tends to break models because it introduces a shock to the system where historical data is not indicative of what's going on now. An incrementality test can be used to pretty quickly say, hey, I am in a new regime. What is going on? let's feed that back into the model quickly and give it time to essentially ratchet to new market conditions in what would otherwise take 6 or 9 or 12 months of data to kind of get its footing. So it is really kind of good on these two pieces, right? Solving the correlation is not causation problem and giving you a way to adapt and be agile to what is a constantly changing environment.
Great. Thanks, Nick. That's great background there and really good insight. We're going to take a quick pause for another poll. For our audience members, please go to slido.com and type in the code 1665435, or you can just use your phone and snap that QR code on the screen. What is your greatest analytics challenge as a marketer? From the list below, of course, not all inclusive, but okay, the results are coming in.
I'm really interested in Noel's answer to this question.
Sorry, say again, Nick.
I'm interested in Noel's answer to this question.
Yeesh, no pressure. All of the above is my answer.
All right. So we've got about 30, 35 results coming in here. So validating media's impact to sales, connecting the marketing and its actual effect on your business, and then taking that and being able to make confident investment decisions. So I think everybody here is probably in the right place.
From where I sit and what I kind of see going on with brands, I'm shocked that so few people are saying getting organizational alignment. Noel touched on it in kind of one of the previous questions. I see it consistently being a big blocker to really getting attribution, reporting, decision-making, kind of the whole marketing operations really kind of humming and aligned against the same goal. So I'm a little surprised that's so low on the list.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good, one more bump there. I think someone switched their answer to getting organizational alignment. Good call out, Nick. Thank you. All right, so moving on, we're going to do a little brief overview of incrementality and talk about testing for a minute. Nick, can you give us a quick couple sentence explanation of what is incrementality for someone who may not be familiar?
Yeah, thanks for the softball, Clay. Incrementality testing, right? If the two words aren't kind of together for you, I would suggest it's not incrementality. And look, incrementality is quickly becoming a buzzword, so I think people use it all over the place. It is specifically referring to a test and control in-market experiment. Now, there are a number of ways to do that, but ultimately you need to be able to produce a way to have a test group, have a control group. That control group, you essentially leave business as usual, and the test group, you introduce some variation in treatment, turn off media, scale up media, you name it. And you essentially look at how did the test group behave differently? Because I only changed one big thing, I should see sales go up or I should see sales go down accordingly. That is essentially the incremental impact of the media treatment in the test. So I highlighting here, testing and specifically a test and control experiment setup.
Thank you. And then what we have here on the right is a handful of examples of types of incrementality tests or tests you can use to measure incrementality. Andrew, a lot of marketers probably got their initial exposure to incrementality testing through their platform partners, Facebook lift tests, things like that. How has the quality of those measurement tools evolved over the years? And do you have any advice for marketers looking to start potentially using those tools?
Yeah, those tools started out being phenomenal. Back in when I started working on the Facebook product with the team that was doing that was 2013. And it was really novel at the time to productize something like that and to scale it out to marketers everywhere. And if you think about where data connections were in 2013, it was pretty much the Wild West. You could link up anything you wanted to anything else, and you had really excellent visibility into associating a conversion off the platform to an exposure on platform, which, by the way, is the fundamental requirement for you to be able to perform incrementality tests at a user level from a platform perspective. If we fast forward to today, what has broken? Well, precisely that, right? It's becoming increasingly hard to link things. There's a lot of problems with pixels. There's even problems now with some of the new iOS regulations that are coming up with the conversion APIs, UTM parameters getting trimmed, all of that is reducing the ability to connect a conversion to an ad exposure. And so with that degraded functionality, not only are the last click and multi-touch type products becoming less useful, but the platform specific lift tests are also having to rely on more and more machine learning, modeling, probabilistic type signals to create those connections. So the math and the science behind it continues to be solid and definitely the gold standard above all else, but the data kind of climate that we're in is making it a lot harder for platforms to do that. And if you think about it, a lot of these platforms now are looking into aggregate style measurement and doing geotests, and you even see Meta has released and a continued update a geotesting framework that's out there. But the challenge with doing all of that is managing the test, right? And that's where I think a platform like Measured really comes into play, where it makes all of the test management, in addition to the math and the science behind it, one kind of all-encompassing solution. So long story short, I wouldn't really trust the platform tests at this time. Not to say that you shouldn't experiment with them and try them out, but I wouldn't rely on them as the singular source of truth for incrementality, especially because you're going to get different, slightly different ways of measuring things, and it's not. You lose the cross-platform capabilities if you're doing a test on Google and a test on Meta and a test on Snap, et cetera. So it's really important to kind of think about ways that you can apply incrementality in an equal capacity to all of the channels that you're measuring.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Going to jump ahead to this quick slide and overview for those who may not be familiar with geotesting. Just given a time check, I do want to make sure we get to our Q&A session. So just going to cruise through this one pretty quickly. But a geotest and kind of Measured's bread and butter is where we're able to identify and split a test and a control market, sometimes at the state level, sometimes down to the zip code level, sometimes as large as the DMA, depending on the scale of the brand and how many sales they're actually generating, where we will hold out media from one market, the test market, and then run media business as usual in another market. We will then measure, in this example, showing Shopify here, but it could be a variety of different conversion types, measuring the delta between the two sales of those two market test cells, the test and the control cell, and then identifying, okay, we lost this many sales in the test market. That is the true incremental impact or lift of that particular media that we are testing. And then,
wait, can I jump in just really quickly to underscore one point relative to privacy? The conversions and the sales that are being looked at for a geotest are not, they don't have to be linked to any kind of ad exposure. They're coming from your source of truth. It could be your subscription database. You could count like physical physical sales, that receipts that you're getting, whatever the best source of truth that you can associate to a geography. That's what makes this so powerful and makes it immune to the privacy situation that's out there.
That's a great point. Exactly. We're not relying on any user level data or pixel data in order to track those sales. That's a great point. Thank you for making that, Andrew. And then, Andrew, I'll throw it right back to you to kind of continue on that thread. What are some kind of best practices you would recommend to brands, starting to run geotests or looking into geotesting as a strategy or, part of their practice?
Yeah, I would say a couple of principles to keep in mind. One, you can start small. The best thing to do especially if you haven't done any kind of incrementality testing or geotesting, is do an overall marketing, mix test, right? Hold back all of your marketing in a particular geo, and you can, figure out where that needs to happen. Tools like Measured and others out there can help you do that. But you can essentially hold out all of your marketing from, certain geographies and try to understand, is that incrementality that you're getting from your aggregate marketing mix, is that within the bounds of the acceptability that you have? So I think that's an easy low-hanging fruit test that everyone here should be running at least, I would say quarterly ideally, but at least half yearly, if not that. And then that sort of brings me to the next principle that you should keep in mind, which is the testing needs to happen regularly. Noel kind of brought this up earlier. I made this point before, and I'll just underscore it. Things change, and just something worked today or didn't work today doesn't mean that it won't necessarily work in the future. So it's very important to make sure that you have a regular testing cadence that allows you to understand how that incremental ROAS and incrementalities is changing over time. And then, you can get more sophisticated depending on how much volume you have, and really break down and have the test do really, really exciting things like help you figure out where your media allocation needs to be. You could look into creative variation, a lot of really special things that you could do with geotesting. But the main thing is start simple, do it coarse grain, look at your overall marketing efficacy, and make sure that you have testing as a regular part of your business cadence. Make sure that you're doing it on a regular basis. You're always coming back to that testing program.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. That's all great information and strategies for brands to think about as they start building out a geotesting practice. We will get back to geotesting later in the Q&A section. And Nick, I do have a question for you about roadmap for testing for brands, but I do want to get through a couple more slides so we can get to the Q&A session. Shifting gears for a second to clearly top of mind for some marketers are the upcoming continuation of privacy changes and the impact of that on certain technology and platforms and capabilities. Nick, in your opinion, should brands be worried about iOS 17? What's your kind of opinion there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to hit on some points Andrew brought up. If you are dependent on user level measurement as your attribution source of truth, look, it's already broken. It's already done. There are interesting things that you can get and data points that you can pull out of that. But if that's how you're doing your attribution, there's a real problem. I mean, the dirty secret here is most of the original MTA, people who invented MTA and originally sold it, have sunset it. They have moved to probabilistic measurement. Facebook, nobody knows for sure, but as much as half of the conversions, last touch conversions they report are modeled. They are not deterministically done at the user level. Everybody has moved away from this and nobody has actually said so. So if you're not kind of in the know on this, then yeah, this is a big deal because Apple isn't allowing you to attach UTM parameters to, click-throughs. And guess what? A lot of people use Safari. So if you're relying on pixel-based measurement, deterministic measurement at the user level, maybe this is coming as a wake-up call, but the dirty secret is like all this stuff was broken anyways. And, just about everybody from the ad platforms to the, MTA vendors that invented this stuff has already kind of moved away from it. But yeah, I mean, this is a wake-up call there. So I would sort of double down on everything Andrew's saying. The reality is it doesn't change the story because it was already broken, but now it's even more broken. It used to have, one wheel and was on fire going down the street. There aren't a lot of wheels left, when you look at kind of post iOS 17, to be perfectly honest.
Thanks, Nick. That's great insight. I thought it would be interesting if we kind of showed, what this really looks like in reality. Obviously, iOS 17 hasn't happened yet, but we can show historically what we measured on the measured platform when iOS 14.5 hit. Now, obviously, iOS 14.5 was a pretty significant impact. But interestingly, what we saw, and this example showing some data across our platform from Facebook, across our brands, when Facebook had the big signal loss from Apple, their CPA started increasing. And a lot of marketers started wondering, okay, is the media actually getting more expensive to achieve what I needed to achieve? Or is it still driving the business that I needed to drive? It's just being reported differently. And through incrementality measurement, we were able to see that the media's impact to sales really hadn't changed that much. It was really, in fact, just the signal loss that Facebook was experiencing from Apple affecting their reporting. Noel, I want to throw a quick question to you. Can you tell us about this time period, as a brand executive, and what that was like and just navigating that, and any advice you might be able to give to brands looking at upcoming changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were pretty fortunate because we had already prepared by implementing an incrementality solution. So we actually had better visibility on this and were less rattled. Of course, it's still rattling when things change, but we were less affected and less inclined to pull back dramatically. Then if you look at the timeline there, not long after that, oh wait, no, 2021, yeah, 2022 is when the wheels really fell off. So yeah, so that's one thing. It's just having had that already set up, we're in a good place to sort of hold steady and feel good about what we were doing. Now, that's like the benefit of having done that in the past. I think the other interesting thing, if you look at that time, is if you read or listen to a number of companies' quarterly reports, in the quarters following this, the number of times this was mentioned as a negative impact, right, to sales and marketing and visibility. So these are big structural impacts that these changes can have. And so by having your own system of record, your own platform set up, whether it's through measured or in-house, but the point being that you can really understand on a long-term basis what normal is, and then you can continue actioning in that way. So I think in this time, a lot of brands had to pull back, like you said, Clay, because they just saw the prices increasing.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, if you focus on CPA, you see one number. If you focus on incremental ROAS, you see a different story.
Right. That's a great point. Thank you for sharing. Last poll, and looks like we already had it open, so a handful of people have started voting, but you can jump in and start voting on this one. Just curious, as a marketer, which of the following is your most important metric that you care about in your business? All right, a lot of ROAS. That makes a lot of sense. I think ROAS is a pretty clear winner here, so we could probably jump ahead. Net profit, interested to see that kind of in second there, and then LTV. Nick or Andrew or Noelle, any comments here?
I would just say that a lot of this represents where a brand is from a maturity is probably not the right word, but we'll just go with it for lack of a better one, perspective. In that if you're at a place where you're really focused on, okay, we got to make sure our marketing dollars are returning at a certain rate, then of course ROAS is your first and primary objective. And I think it should always continue to be. But depending on where you are in your life cycle or your growth as a brand, there's only so much more you can add from a like Google perspective, for example. And then you also need to consider which categories or which types of ads and campaigns are actually driving profitable growth. And then it's about what is the relationship between the customer acquisition costs and the lifetime value of the customer. So CAC to LTV becomes a much more important piece of the pie and the piece of the puzzle. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about really being clear on the goals, right? If you've got one person and all they're focused on is ROAS, they might do something differently than another part of the team or another member of the org who's really focused on, a CPA to CAC to LTV ratio, or another one that's not here. It's like, how does marketing as a percentage of overall revenue or net revenue fall into place, right? So again, goes back to what are your goals short term today, but then also longer term in terms of what are you trying to achieve as a brand.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate what you noted about how it's kind of a continuum and that you really need to have alignment across the brand. Because as you said, if people are gold or operating against different metrics, they're going to make different decisions and like to see different results. A little more data just to share from our platform. Nothing too surprising here, I think, but Google and Facebook still dominating share of wallet across our portfolio brands. Noelle, Andrew, does this surprise you guys at all? Yes or no?
No, not really.
No, it doesn't surprise me either. This is pretty par for the course with what I would expect. Yeah, I think I would imagine that if most brands did incrementality testing, though, this would shift around a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then a couple more trends here. And we actually did have a Q&A, and noting we're going to get to the Q&A in just a second. If you go into Slido, you can actually vote and upvote other people's questions if you'd like to see them answered. I did note that one of the questions during one of our earlier charts on the platform versus incremental ROAS, someone did ask about TikTok prospecting. So just a few stats here, and feel free to comment, panelists, on if any of this interests you or you find surprising. But incremental ROAS, and this is from the beginning of the year till now. So this is essentially first half of this year. I
actually have a question on this one. Maybe Nick, you can answer. Is Is there like a correlation between or causation between PMAX and the allocation increase and the fact that Google is forcing more brands into PMAX, right? So like, again, just because a piece of data shows you something doesn't mean that it's like, oh, that's working. It might be simply because Google's like, thou shalt PMAX now.
You're definitely right. I would also say brands are still figuring out PMAX performance. So we see results that are all over the place. But I would expect that there will be a consolidation around PMAX, and I don't think brands are going to have a choice. We're already seeing it. I think most brands have kind of just seen the writing on the wall and are moving that direction. I will say, positively speaking, PMAX can deliver incremental value. There are probably a lot of fine print about how to set those up to make sure that's the case, that really matter here. So yes, that's definitely the case. I mean, the other one that everybody always asks about is TikTok. Like you'll note kind of here, I do think it lags incremental performance, like incremental ROAS, like let's just, compared to say Facebook, but it is improving and it's improving quickly. And I think what we see is brands are kind of investing ahead of the curve with an expectation of kind of where it's going. And, I think it's ad tech. It is, improving quickly. There's obviously a lot of eyeballs there. I won't get into the government or regulation stuff because I don't know where that's heading, but it does feel like brands are kind of strategically investing there. And that's why you see, the investment probably outsizing the return there. I think brands are kind of thinking that we're a little Facebook 2015-ish, right? Where if you're in early, you're kind of trying to get ahead of where the market may be going.
It's a great point. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note that increase of 2x on the incremental ROAS of TikTok has happened just in the last 5.5 months. So we have certainly been seeing the return on investment there.
And Facebook got hit hard by iOS, probably the hardest. I think Facebook, Snap, Pinterest, the like were probably the hardest hit by iOS. So that little bit loss of share of wallet, that's part of it. I think their response, at least in part, advantage shopping, which is newer, that's also part of this. I mean, brands are starting to kind of explore advantage shopping. It just got approved for geo-targeting in the past month. So we're pushing out a ton of Facebook ASC campaigns. I expect we'll have a view pretty quickly of what the performance looks like. And look, I think with all new ad products, the performance tends to be a little all over the place because people haven't established best practices. The platforms aren't good about saying, hey, here's exactly how you should set these up for success. Maybe that's a question for Andrew. Maybe they don't know. I get the impression with, use the Google PMAX example. I get the impression they're still figuring it out as well as far as the best practices to kind of set those things up for success.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. Thank you for sharing. All right, this is actually our last slide, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A. Feel free to jump back in there. We have a couple great questions being upvoted. Noelle, do you want to leave the participants today with some recommendations? What can you tell us about your experience helping teams reorient around new metrics and building a culture of experimentation at a brand?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is probably the top of the list right there, right? Is that everybody needs to be on board with this test and learn approach. And I've worked at a brand where that wasn't a thing, and it was here's your creative, have fun. You don't get a version B because we don't test it because it's perfect. That doesn't really work in this case. You need to be able to test all sorts of different iterations. And so that brings you down to the second point around aligning the organization, right? So obviously marketing, if you've got channel managers in-house, they've got to be aligned on budgets might shift, and that's okay because what we're doing is what's best for the entire brand. And I have a lot of thoughts too there around like if somebody's budget gets shrunk and they're feeling bad about it, how do you help them grow and learn another channel, right? Like there's ways that people can continue to contribute and grow in that kind of environment. Then there's also finance, obviously, and the data and analytics team all needs to be on board on this kind of stuff. But one team that I think often gets, I don't want to say forgotten about, but they're sort of the last ones to know is creative. And with all of this testing, there is a very heavy lift on a creative and a design team. And so first is like, how do you shoot creative or create content in a way that it can be manipulated to test across platforms, while it's still in the can, if you will, before it's even produced? How do you plan for that? But then the other is bring the creative team in on the process. Aside from that one example I mentioned at the beginning, I have never met anyone who's a creative in a brand, in a business, who doesn't ask like, which one worked the best? They want to know too, and they want to create great stuff that really resonates. So I think the more you can bring people into the fold early, get them excited about this process, make it like a fun competition, but also something that everyone is working on together. So it's a competition for which content works the best, maybe, but that doesn't mean somebody's thing is going away, right? It's really a pragmatic approach to what resonates the most with our customer or our potential customer, and how can we find it and then do more of it.
Great. Thank you, Noelle. That's great advice for building a gold standard attribution practice. Andrew, any last notes for marketers that you'd like them to think about as they're building their practices?
Yeah, I would just want to underscore everything Noelle just said. I found that, first of all, I think it was super well articulated. It's exactly kind of the approach that I use with my current clients that are performance marketers, and really, going back to the organizational alignment. I think the most important thing that a marketer can have is a commitment from leadership, from cross-functional leadership around, hey, we are going to value our marketing using incrementality, using science to market it. We're not going to use, pseudoscience and MTA and stuff just because it's easy or seemingly easy. We're going to actually invest the hard work to do it the right way, and that's how we're going to judge our performance. And I think that's easier said than done, because there's a lot of legacy systems, tools, processes, blah blah blah, that's built around maybe a suboptimal way of measuring things. But I do think that it is 100% worth the effort to revisit all of those, maybe tear some things down and rebuild them if needed, and that will pay dividends in the long term and even in the short term. So it's not an easy process, but it's certainly something that is worth doing. And if you can't do that right away, easiest thing to do is do a total media holdout test, using an incrementality measuring tool to do that, and just start to educate people like, hey, we thought our ROI was here, it's actually here. Could be better, could be worse, we don't know, but at least you've got a data point to kind of go and start that tough conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's great advice. And actually that covers a couple topics that came in as questions. I know we are really close to time. We had some really great discussion today, but I would love to throw out one or two questions to the panelists. For those who do have to jump at the top of the hour, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar, and we'll also be sending out an FAQ with some of the top questions that we got, and we will answer them and share those with folks who have registered. So thank you so much. All right, just 1 to 2 questions for the panelists right now. The first question is, speaking of testing cadence, can a geotest include 2 tests at one time, or how long after a test can another test go live? Nick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into kind of how you're designing it. And look, I'll kind of say the worst version is to randomly split the country in half and then, look at sales drop pre and post a test. That's going to be very limiting on that front. If you're doing a carefully designed counterfactual and you have a good prediction and an AA accuracy in the 1.5% range, you can probably test on 10% of the country, which means you can probably run 3, 4, 5, 6 tests at once. We have brands that test, as many as 6 or 8 tests running at once. I would generally say that you do want a cool off period for any market that's involved in a test. We generally will say 4 to 6 weeks. But like I said, if you have that sort of setup, you can kind of be rotating through test markets on a pretty regular basis. It doesn't become very restrictive. I'll throw it out there. Like we have brands, we have a brand that has run 60 geotests year to date, right? So you can probably geotest as large as your appetite is for it. I would guess that you run out of organizational appetite before you run out of practical data science appetite.
Great. And that kind of relates to how precise your practice is for choosing those markets, so that you can run more tests. Thank you for sharing, Nick. That's great. Quick question someone had is, did the data we showed from the platform versus incrementality ROAS cover multiple industries? That was across our entire portfolio. Within our platform, our clients can filter by their particular industry to see data relevant to them. So yes, that does apply to all industries, and is average across our portfolio. So just wanted to answer that. Question about GA4. Is data-driven measurement from GA4 any closer to incremental measurement? Andrew or Nick, do one of you guys want to take that one?
You want to say it at the same time, Andrew?
1, 2, 3, no.
Google Analytics is incapable of measuring incrementality for a lot of the reasons we touched, but it's not only not getting closer, it's incapable and moving further away from it.
Thank you, Nick. Andrew, so a similar question, maybe the answer is no or none. Which platforms are making the best adjustments to show incrementality rather than serving their own interests? Are any platforms in particular looking in that direction that you know of?
I mean, I think all of the platforms that I'm aware of have either first-party incrementality solutions or partnerships with third-party providers that can somehow do it. So I think they're all around the same in terms of their understanding that incrementality is desired, but are kind of hamstrung in their ability to deeply integrate it into the ad tech stacks. So I wouldn't say that anyone is right now kind of stands head and shoulders above the rest. They're all at varying levels of maturity of the development of their kind of first party products. But really the better question to ask here is, how can I measure all of these platforms in an apples to apples capacity from an incrementality basis? And you know, really the answer is you could have to turn to geotesting, a tool like Measured, something like that, to be able to do that. Ultimately, if you have that capability in your hands, you can pick and choose the parameters, and over time you can understand what parameters work together to generate for you, the marketer, the most incrementality on each platform. It's not going to be the same for marketer to marketer, and certainly not platform to platform. So combination of bid, budget, creative, targeting, all of that, you know, all of that and then some, you know, that's gonna kind of be a specialized cocktail for your particular situation. And the only way you can figure that out is with an objective third-party measurement that's incrementality based.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. We'll ask one more question. Interesting question. It was for a particular brand, but I think the question really centers around long sales journey brands. So how do you manage testing with a brand who may have a longer sales cycle, 30 to 60 days or longer?
There's a lot of ways to do it, but I would suggest you want to do multi-funnel measurement, right? So you want to pick different points in the funnel and try to measure across them. Within that, there are ways to kind of extend out and do longer term tests and things like that, but it does get tougher. It doesn't get impossible. I think you have to kind of focus on trying to get measurements across the funnel when you have that sort of situation.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. Really appreciate that. All right, we are just over time. I appreciate the number of people who stayed on to participate in the Q&A. We will be answering additional questions and following up with everybody with those answers. Additionally, we did get a lot of questions about other types of data cuts from our platform. We do measure a ton of channels and have a lot of different metrics and insights on those. You're more than welcome to shoot me an email if you have any particular questions. But otherwise, we really appreciate you joining our session today. I want to give a special thanks to our panelists, Noel, Andrew, Nick. Thank you all so much for joining. We really appreciate it and look forward to seeing everybody on our next webinar. So thanks again for coming.